Okay, let's dive in. That sound, right? The scratchy guitar hum. Maybe you still have a flannel shirt somewhere.
Definitely.
That feeling in the 90s, it was so different from the big hair and synths before it.
Oh, completely different.
You pointed us towards 90s alternative rock, and yeah, it felt like a jolt to the whole system.
It's really interesting, isn't it, how that musical shift, it wasn't just about, chords or beats.
No.
It tapped into something uh, much deeper. You had this whole generation kind of figuring things out,
Right.
navigating a changing world. And this sound, so raw, often quite introspective, it just became their voice.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt like someone finally turned the volume way up on feelings that maybe weren't getting much airplay, in the mainstream.
Exactly.
Your sources really brought that out, that sense of pushing back against all the polished stuff that was everywhere. It was like music just went, okay, let's get real for a minute.
And you have to think about the context, the early 90s. The Cold War had just ended.
Right, a lot was changing. Right.
There was this growing awareness of social issues. The internet was just starting to flicker.
Yeah.
All that uncertainty, that questioning,
Yeah.
that definitely fueled the whole alternative scene, I think, that creative energy.
And smack in the middle of it all, like your sources make crystal clear, was Nirvana. Never mind. 1991.
Oh, yeah.
That album, and especially Smells Like Teen Spirit, it didn't just land, it like detonated.
It really did. A cultural earthquake, like you said.
It wasn't just another hit song.
No. And what's so interesting about Teen Spirit is how it grabbed that feeling, that youthful angst, the alienation, but wrapped it up in something incredibly catchy. It had that raw power, totally new for top 40 radio.
Right.
But also this melody you couldn't ignore. That combination, I think that's what let it just explode and shake up the whole pop world.
And Kurt Cobain,
Yeah,
suddenly he's this icon. Almost against his will, it seems.
very much so.
The sources you shared really hit on how uncomfortable he was with that level of fame, being called the voice of a generation.
Yeah, he seemed to struggle with that intensely.
Yeah, his music, his whole presence,
Mm-hmm.
it just connected with so many people on such a deep level.
Totally.
And then his passing later on, tragically, it just cemented that legend, didn't it?
It really speaks to the power of vulnerability in art, I think. Cobain wasn't projecting perfection. His struggles felt real. They were right there in the music.
Yeah.
That honesty, plus the undeniable songwriting.
Yeah.
That's why Nirvana's impact was just so huge and, frankly, why we're still talking about it.
And from that explosion, you get this whole scene bubbling up, especially in Seattle. Grunge becomes the word, right?
Yeah, the Seattle sound.
Bands like Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains,
Okay.
all finding their own space, but part of this movement.
Yeah.
What was it about Seattle then? Why there?
Well, Seattle in the late 80s, early 90s, it was kind of unique. You had this strong DIY, do-it-yourself ethic, a bit of a reaction against the maybe excesses of the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
and it was kind of geographically isolated too.
Ah,
So a sound could develop without maybe quite as much pressure from the big labels right away. These bands, they were different, but they shared this raw, unfiltered thing.
it wasn't all the same sound, though, was it? Like, Pearl Jam often felt more anthemic, almost stadium-ready,
Yeah, bigger choruses sometimes.
while Soundgarden had those complex, almost metal-ish rhythms, and Chris Cornell's voice.
Incredible range, yeah. And Alice in Chains, they had that darkness, didn't they?
Yeah.
Really haunting with those signature vocal harmonies.
Definitely distinct. So grunge was huge, but alternative was broader than just Seattle, right?
Oh, absolutely. As the decade went on, the umbrella got bigger.
Yeah.
Your sources mentioned bands like Radiohead,
Mm-hmm.
R.E.M., the Smashing Pumpkins. They weren't strictly grunge, but they were absolutely vital to the whole 90s alternative sound and its themes.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Radiohead, especially later in the 90s, they just started pushing things sonically.
They really did.
You listen to OK Computer. Suddenly there are all these electronic textures, this experimental vibe. They showed alternative could really evolve.
What's fascinating with Radiohead is how they took that initial alternative impulse, that breaking away,
Yeah.
and applied it to the sound itself. Not just different guitars, but whole new sonic worlds, different things to write about beyond just, straightforward angst.
And then R.E.M., like your sources said, they were almost the elder statesmen of the scene.
Kind of the pioneers, yeah.
They'd already hit the mainstream in the 80s, really.
Yeah.
They sort of paved the way, showed alternative could be huge.
Definitely. Albums like Out of Time,
Yeah.
massive hits.
Each year.
It showed you could have those alternative roots, that different sensibility, and still connect with millions of people. R.E.M.'s earlier success was crucial.
How so?
It proved that music outside the usual pop formula could find a big audience without, you know, selling out its core ideas. They kind of normalized it, made the ground fertile for Nirvana to then just smash through.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly. The flannel shirt. It's like the uniform.
The visual shorthand, yeah.
But one of your sources mentioned it wasn't some deliberate fashion thing at first, just practical work clothes in the Pacific Northwest.
Exactly. It kind of punctures the whole manufactured rebellion idea.
I found that fascinating.
It really highlights that authenticity thing that was so key. Flannel was about being unpretentious, down to earth. It wasn't a costume. It
Oh,
was
yeah.
just comfortable, practical.
Yeah.
And that became the statement, that it wasn't trying to be a statement.
Huh. The ultimate anti-fashion statement accidentally becomes fashion?
Love it.
Pretty much.
Okay, let's dig back into some key moments your sources flagged. We mentioned Nirvana, but it's worth saying again, Nevermind was the catalyst, wasn't it?
Absolutely the catalyst.
Yeah.
Dragged alternative from the college radio stations right into everyone's living room.
What made it cross over so effectively?
I think it was that mix. It had the raw, edgy sound from the underground.
But also these incredibly well-written pop melodies, that tension, that combination of raw energy and killer hooks, that's what let it connect with a massive audience where maybe earlier stuff hadn't quite managed it.
And then Pearl Jam, taking that very public stand against Ticketmaster. That felt significant.
Oh, hugely. Over the service charges.
Yeah. It felt like they were using their fame to actually fight for their fans, challenge the system.
It really tapped into that anti-corporate feeling that was kind of bubbling under the surface in the scene.
Right.
It wasn't just about music. It was about principles, challenging the big guys, trying to get a fair deal for the audience. It resonated.
And Radiohead, we touched on them, but OK Computer really stands out as this landmark.
Totally.
Blending rock, electronics. It felt groundbreaking, but still really emotional.
What's important about Radiohead's path is how it showed the artistic potential within alternative. It wasn't just one sound.
Right. It could grow.
It could be a space for real innovation, for pushing boundaries, not just sticking to a formula.
And R.E.M. again. Just thinking about their journey. From tiny clubs to stadiums, they really did lay that groundwork.
Their story is so important. It showed you could stick to your artistic guns, make the music you believed in.
And still find success.
Exactly. Without just chasing trends, their longevity, they're still relevant. It shows the power of that authentic approach.
Okay, last big piece. Lollapalooza. Started as Perry Farrell's farewell tour for Jane's Addiction.
Yeah, that was the initial idea.
But it became this huge traveling festival, a real focal point for the whole alternative community.
Incredibly significant. Lolla created this actual physical space, all these diverse alternative bands.
Together on one bill.
Reaching huge crowds, way bigger than they might on their own. It built this sense of community for the fans, too, like, we're part of this thing.
Outside the mainstream.
Exactly. More than just concerts, it was a cultural moment. It helped cement alternative music's place.
So looking back at all this deep dive, it's clear 90s alternative rock wasn't just music.
Not at all.
It was a cultural pivot, right? Reflecting changing values, how a generation saw itself.
Yeah.
That sense of authenticity, being raw, being honest, that feels like the core of it.
And what's fascinating is how that still resonates, doesn't it? Even now. In our world, which can feel so curated, so polished,
Yeah, very true.
there's still this hunger for something genuine, something real in art and culture. The legacy isn't just history, it's in that ongoing search.
Absolutely. So the big takeaway here, 90s alternative, a true cultural revolution. It voiced a generation's frustrations, their hopes, and you can still hear its echoes in music today. It just shows how powerful authenticity and emotional honesty can be.
Which brings up maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. In today's world, where do you see that same spirit? That raw authenticity finding a voice?
Interesting.
It might not sound like a distorted guitar anymore. Maybe it's somewhere else entirely.
Yeah.
But where does that kind of unfiltered expression pop up today, and why do you think we still need it?